There is a moment in the 13th century that historians still struggle to fully explain. An army moves across the Central Asian steppe, thousands of riders crossing frozen rivers in winter, descending from mountains that no army had crossed before them, appearing outside city walls that their enemies thought were safe from any possible direction of attack. The city of Samarkand, one of the wealthiest and most defended cities on earth, falls in 12 days. The city of Merv, which claimed to be the greatest city in the world, is erased so completely that for generations people argue about where exactly it once stood. And the army that did this was not made up of professional soldiers serving a great civilization. It was made up of nomads from a land so cold, so barren, and so far removed from the centers of the known world that most of the people they were about to conquer had never even heard of them. This is the story of the Mongol Empire, and it is, without question, one of the strangest and most consequential stories in the history of the world. To understand how the Mongols built the largest contiguous land empire in human history, you first need to understand the world they came from. The Mongolian steppe in the 12th century was not a civilization in any conventional sense. There were no cities, no written language, no established religion, no central authority. What there was grass. An enormous, windswept plateau stretching thousands of miles across Central Asia, cold enough in winter to kill a man exposed overnight, dry enough in summer to crack the earth underfoot. The people who lived there were organized into tribes and clans that existed in a state of almost constant low-level warfare with each other. They raided each other's herds, kidnapped each other's women, and formed shifting alliances that could dissolve within a generation. There was no concept of a unified Mongolian people. The Mongols, the Tatars, the Merkits, the Naimans, the Karaits, all of these groups spoke related languages and shared similar ways of life. But they were as likely to be at war with each other as with anyone else. Into this world, sometime around the year 1162, a boy was born near the Onon River in what is now northern Mongolia. His father named him Temujin, which means iron worker, and the story goes that he was born clutching a blood clot in his fist, an omen that seers interpreted to mean he would be a great warrior. His father was Yasuge, the leader of a minor clan, not a powerful man, but not an insignificant one either. And for a few years, Temujin's childhood was ordinary by the standards of his world. Learning to ride before he could properly walk, spending his days in the felt tents called gurs that the steppe peoples had used for centuries. But then his father died. Yasuge was poisoned by Tatars, longtime enemies of his clan, when Temujin was around 9 years old. And what happened next tells you something essential about the world the Mongols came from. When Yasuge died, the clan that he had led simply abandoned his family. They left Temujin, his mother Holin, and his younger siblings alone on the steppe, with almost no resources, no allies, no protection. In the Mongolian tribal world, loyalty was to the living leader, not to his bloodline. A dead chief was a finished story. His widow and children were someone else's problem, or more accurately, no one's problem at all. They survived, barely, by foraging. Holun dug up roots and gathered berries. The children fished in the Onon River. For years, Temujin lived on the edge of starvation in one of the harshest environments on earth, watching his father's former followers prosper without him. This period of poverty and abandonment is not a minor footnote in Temujin's life. It is everything. It explains almost every major decision he would make as a leader, every institution he would build, every loyalty system he would create. He understood, from direct personal experience, exactly what it felt like to be thrown away, and he spent the rest of his life building something that could never be thrown away. There was another event from his adolescence that left a similarly deep mark. His betrothed, a young woman named Borte, was kidnapped by a rival tribe called the Merkits. In the tribal world, this was not exactly uncommon. Women were taken in raids, traded as political currency, used as prizes, but Temujin did not accept this as a fact of life. He gathered allies, notably his blood brother Jamuka, and a powerful chief named Togrul, who had been a friend of his father, and he launched a rescue operation that succeeded. He got Borte back, and in doing so he demonstrated something that would define his entire career. He was willing to act where other men accepted their situation. He was willing to form alliances across clan lines, to call in favors, to move decisively when others hesitated. Over the following years, Temujin did something that no one on the Mongolian steppe had managed to do before him in any lasting way. He began unifying the tribes, but the method he used was not the method that previous would-be steppe unifiers had tried. Earlier leaders had attempted to build coalitions through blood ties and traditional clan loyalties. Temujin understood from his own experience that blood ties meant nothing when the strong man was gone. So instead, he built his coalition on a different principle: merit and personal loyalty to him directly, not to a clan, not to a bloodline, not to a tradition. The men who fought for Temujin and proved themselves could rise to command positions regardless of where they came from. The men who betrayed him, regardless of their clan, were destroyed. And the men who showed loyalty to their previous leaders when captured by Temujin, men who refused to betray their own commanders even under threat of death, were often rewarded for that loyalty and incorporated into his own forces. Because a man who is loyal to his lord, Temujin reasoned, is a man worth having. This was a genuinely new idea on the steppe. And it worked. By 1206, after decades of warfare, alliance building, betrayal, counter-betrayal, and the systematic defeat of every rival power on the Mongolian plateau, Temujin called a great gathering of all the Mongol tribes, an assembly called a Kurultai. And there, by the banks of the Onon River, where he had fished as a half-starved child, he was proclaimed Genghis Khan. The title roughly translates as universal ruler or oceanic ruler, the idea being that his authority extended in all directions as far as an ocean. It was not a modest claim, but by this point he had earned the right to make it. The organizational structure he imposed on the unified Mongols after 1206 was, in retrospect, one of the great institutional innovations in military history. He abolished the old tribal system entirely. He reorganized the entire Mongol people into a decimal military structure based on units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, called a tumen. These units were deliberately scrambled across old tribal lines. Men from different clans were put together in the same unit, commanded by leaders who had proven themselves loyal to Genghis personally. The old tribal identities were not banned. People still knew where they came from, but they were no longer the basis for military organization. Your unit was your loyalty. Your commander was your commander. And your commander's commander was ultimately Genghis Khan. The effect of this was profound. It meant that the Mongol army could not fracture along tribal lines during a campaign because the tribal lines had been deliberately disrupted. It meant that capable men could rise through the ranks regardless of their birth, which meant the army constantly promoted competence over aristocratic connection. And it meant that the personal loyalty of the entire military structure ran directly up to Genghis Khan himself, with no intermediate power centers that might develop competing ambitions. He also established a legal code called the Yasa, which applied to all Mongols regardless of clan. The Yasa covered everything from military conduct to personal behavior to trade disputes. It was not written down at first, because the Mongols had no written language, but it was memorized and enforced. It created a kind of equality before the law that was genuinely unusual for its time and place. A noble could be executed under the Yasa just as easily as a commoner. This was not how most hierarchical societies of the 13th century operated. With a unified people, a reformed army, and a legal code, Genghis Khan turned outward. And the first thing the outside world needed to understand, though it would take most of them a catastrophically long time to figure this out, was that the Mongol army was not an army in the conventional sense. It was not an infantry force supplemented by cavalry. It was almost entirely cavalry, and it operated at speeds and over distances that sedentary armies simply could not match. Every Mongol warrior maintained a string of horses, typically 4 to 6 animals, which he rotated throughout a campaign. This meant that a Mongol army could cover 60, 70, even 100 miles in a single day if necessary, while maintaining the horses' stamina for the actual fighting at the end of that movement. No army in the world at that time could sustain that kind of operational tempo. And what this meant in practice was that Mongol armies could appear where they were not expected, when they were not expected. over and over again. Enemies who thought they understood the geography of a campaign, who thought the mountains or the rivers or the sheer distance guaranteed them a certain amount of preparation time, kept finding out that they were wrong. The Mongol warrior himself was trained from childhood to ride and to shoot a composite bow while riding at full gallop. The composite bow used by Mongol archers was a technological marvel, built from layers of horn, wood, and sinew laminated together, capable of generating more energy per pound than almost any other bow design and accurate at ranges that European observers consistently found difficult to believe. A trained Mongol archer could put an arrow into a man-sized target at 150 yards while moving at speed, and a Mongol army might field tens of thousands of men with this skill. The arrow storm they could generate was not a metaphor. It was a physical weather event that descended on opposing forces and simply killed everything in the open. But the Mongols were not simply fast riders with good bows. What made them truly dangerous was their tactical sophistication. Genghis Khan and his generals had developed and refined a set of tactical doctrines that were, by the standards of the time, extraordinarily advanced. The feigned retreat was their signature move, and it worked with almost embarrassing reliability against opponents who had not faced it before. A Mongol force would engage an enemy, appear to break under pressure, and flee in apparent panic. The enemy, seeing victory within reach, would break formation to pursue, and then the fleeing Mongols would wheel around, having drawn the enemy into a killing ground prepared by other units waiting out of sight, and destroy them utterly. This maneuver worked not once but repeatedly against armies that should have known better, because the psychological pull of an apparently fleeing enemy is almost impossible to resist in the heat of battle. They also excelled at what would today be called combined arms operations, coordinating cavalry archers, heavy cavalry lancers, and when the situation demanded it, siege engineers into a single integrated force. The siege engineering capability deserves particular attention because the conventional image of Mongols is as pure steppe cavalry utterly helpless before city walls. This image is wrong. When Genghis Khan first encountered serious fortifications, he did what he always did when he encountered a capability he lacked. He found people who had it and incorporated them. Chinese engineers, Persian engineers, engineers captured from every civilization the Mongols rolled over, were pressed into service building and operating catapults, trebuchets, battering rams, and fire projection devices. By the time of the Great Western Campaigns, the Mongol army had a siege train capable of reducing virtually any fortification on Earth. The intelligence apparatus that supported Mongol military operations was another element that most of their opponents fatally underestimated. Before any major campaign, Mongol agents, typically merchants, travelers, or diplomatic envoys, would spend months or even years in the target territory. They mapped roads, recorded the locations of water sources, assessed the quality of fortifications, identified political tensions that could be exploited, and reported on troop dispositions. When a Mongol army finally moved, its generals had a level of information about the terrain and the enemy that the enemy typically had no equivalent knowledge of. The Mongols knew where the passes were. They knew which rivers could be forded in which seasons. They knew which cities had grain stores and which had recently suffered famines. They knew, sometimes in remarkable detail, the personal ambitions and grievances of the commanders arrayed against them. This intelligence gathering fed directly into the Mongol approach to psychological warfare, which was in many ways their most effective weapon. The reputation of the Mongol army was deliberately cultivated as a military asset. Cities and kingdoms that submitted without resistance were treated relatively well, their rulers often retained in administrative positions, their populations left intact, their religious institutions respected. Cities and kingdoms that resisted were treated with ferocious violence, their populations slaughtered or enslaved, their walls torn down, their fields salted. This binary treatment was not simply brutality, it was policy, and it was communicated as widely as possible. When a Mongol army approached, its reputation arrived first, and that reputation was designed to make the calculation of resistance versus submission come out in only one direction. The policy worked with remarkable consistency. City after city opened its gates rather than face the army that had just destroyed its neighbor. Rulers, who might otherwise have fought to the last, chose negotiated surrender because they had heard what had happened to those who chose the alternative. The psychological warfare did not just make individual conquests easier. It multiplied the effective reach of Mongol power, allowing them to neutralize threats and absorb territories without fighting at all. An empire won partly through terror is still an empire. The first great test of the new Mongol state was against the Xisha kingdom in what is now northwestern China, beginning in 1205. The Xisha were not a minor power. They controlled important trade routes, had a substantial army, and had fortified cities that had resisted previous attackers. The Mongols raided them repeatedly over several years, learning the terrain and the defenses, before launching a full conquest beginning in 1209. The campaign demonstrated both the strengths and the early limitations of Mongol power. They could move fast, they could win field battles, but siege warfare was still new to them. The Xisha campaign forced the development of the siege capabilities that would become so lethal in later campaigns. By 1211, Genghis Khan turned North China, attacking the Jin dynasty, which controlled the great civilization of northern China with its tens of millions of people, its vast cities, its centuries of administrative sophistication, and its Great Wall. The Great Wall, by the way, proved essentially useless against the Mongols, not because they climbed it or broke through it, but because they simply went around it at points where the geography made that possible. And because the wall's defensive value depends entirely on who is manning it and whether those people are loyal to the government they serve. Jin dynasty border troops who defected, or simply melted away, were a more decisive factor than any physical barrier. The Jin campaign lasted for years and involved some of the largest battles in medieval Chinese history. The Jin dynasty had an army of several 100,000 men. It had cavalry of its own. It had cities that were genuine engineering achievements in fortification. None of this ultimately mattered. The Mongols moved faster, hit harder, and could not be pinned down in the kind of static defensive warfare that Chinese military tradition had optimized for. The Jin capital fell in 1215, and though the Jin dynasty itself was not fully destroyed until 1234 under Genghis Khan's successors, the conquest of northern China was effectively complete as a strategic matter by the time Genghis turned west. The western turn brought the Mongols into contact with the Khwarezmian Empire, which controlled much of Central Asia, including the legendary cities of Samarkand, Bukhara, and Merv. The Khwarezmian Shah, Muhammad II, controlled a territory larger than France and Germany combined, with a population of millions and an army of several 100,000 soldiers. By any conventional measure, he should have been able to stop the Mongols. He had the numbers, he had the fortifications, he had the resources. What he did not have was good judgment or functioning intelligence about what he was dealing with. The proximate cause of the war was a spectacular miscalculation by Muhammad II. Genghis Khan had sent a trade delegation to the Khwarezmian city of Otrar, a caravan of perhaps 400 to 500 merchants. The governor of Otrar, either on his own initiative or on the Shah's orders, had the entire delegation massacred and the goods confiscated. Genghis Khan then sent a diplomatic mission asking for an explanation and the return of the goods or their equivalent. Muhammad II had the lead ambassador executed and the other two envoys humiliated, their beards shaved off. This was, in the diplomatic conventions of the time and place, an act of war so blatant and so contemptuous that it could only be answered with force. What followed was not simply a war, it was a systematic destruction. The Mongol army that crossed the Sir-Darya River in 1219 numbered perhaps 150,000 to 200,000 men, which was somewhat smaller than the Khwarezmian forces. But Muhammad II, uncertain which of his cities would be attacked and apparently not fully trusting his subordinate commanders, spread his forces thin by distributing them among his garrisons. This was almost certainly the decisive strategic error of the campaign. A concentrated Khwarezmian army might have forced a battle on relatively equal terms. Dispersed across dozens of separate garrisons, those same men could be isolated and destroyed piecemeal. The speed and flexibility of the Mongol advance was unlike anything the Islamic world had ever seen. While the main Mongol force moved on Otrar to deal with the governor who had ordered the massacre of the trade delegation, Genghis Khan dispatched his sons and generals on coordinated operations across a front thousands of miles wide. The city of Bukhara, which Muhammad II had presumably considered safe, was approached from an unexpected direction across desert that the Khwarezmians had not thought passable by an army. It fell after minimal resistance. When Genghis Khan rode into the main mosque of Bukhara after its capture, he reportedly told the assembled population that he was God's punishment sent to them for their sins. Whether he actually said this or whether it was attributed to him later is disputed, but the sentiment captured something real about how the Mongol conquests felt to their victims. This was not an invasion that could be reasoned with or appeased. It was a natural force. Samarkand, which was probably the finest city in Central Asia, fell in 12 days. The garrison of several 100,000 men, depending on which source you consult, was defeated or defected. The population was categorized by usefulness. Artisans and specialists were sent east to serve Mongol purposes. Soldiers who had surrendered were organized and then massacred. The general population was allowed to return to the city under Mongol administration. Samarkand survived, diminished and transformed, but it survived. Merv did not. The ancient city on the Murgab River, which called itself the Queen of the World and had a population perhaps in the hundreds of thousands, was captured, its defenders killed, its population assembled in the plains outside the city and systematically executed. Medieval sources give figures of over 1 million dead, which modern historians largely regard as impossible. But whatever the actual number, the destruction was real enough that Merv effectively ceased to exist as a major city for centuries. Contemporary travelers who visited the site a generation later described a landscape of bones. The atrocity at Merv was not madness. It was, from the Mongol perspective, a logical continuation of the same psychological warfare calculus that drove all their military policy. Merv had resisted. The consequences of resistance were advertised as clearly and emphatically as possible. The goal was to ensure that the next city, and the city after that, would remember what had happened to those who fought back and would choose differently. By the time Genghis Khan died in 1227, during a campaign against the Xi who had revolted while the Mongols were occupied in Central Asia, the Mongol Empire controlled an area stretching from the Pacific coast of China to the Caspian Sea. It was already the largest empire in the history of the world, and it was not done growing. His sons and grandsons would push the boundaries further still, into Russia, Poland, Hungary, Persia, Iraq, Korea, Vietnam, and the Song dynasty of southern China. At its peak, under his grandson Kublai Khan, in the late 13th century, the Mongol Empire and its successor states covered roughly 24 million square kilometers, about 16% of the total land surface of the earth. What is almost as remarkable as the size of this empire is the administrative system that governed it. The popular image of the Mongols as pure destroyers, as civilizational exterminators who left nothing but ruins in their wake, is significantly inaccurate, or rather, it is only accurate about a specific and deliberate aspect of Mongol policy, while ignoring the larger picture. Yes, cities that resisted were destroyed. Yes, the death toll of the Mongol conquests was extraordinary, with some scholars estimating total deaths in the tens of millions across all the conquered territories, representing in some regions a significant fraction of the total population. This was real. This was catastrophic. No serious historian minimizes it. But the Mongols also did something else. They governed. The administrative approach they developed was sophisticated precisely because they were so few relative to the populations they controlled. The total number of ethnic Mongols was probably no more than 1 million people at the empire's founding. The territories they conquered contained populations in the hundreds of millions. Simple arithmetic made direct Mongol administration of every conquered territory impossible. So they developed a system of indirect rule that was, by the standards of medieval empire building, unusually pragmatic and flexible. Conquered territories were generally allowed to maintain their existing administrative structures, their languages, their legal systems, and crucially, their religions. The Mongols themselves had no universal religion they were trying to impose. The Great Khan and his family patronized Buddhism, Nestorian Christianity, Islam, Taoism, and shamanism at various times, and tolerated all of them. This was not tolerance in the modern ideological sense. It was political pragmatism. Religious communities that were left to practice their faith and run their own affairs were less likely to revolt. Administrators who already knew how to run a Persian or Chinese bureaucracy were more useful than Mongol warriors who knew nothing about irrigation management or tax collection. The result was a form of empire that could absorb and utilize the administrative capacity of the civilizations it conquered. Persian bureaucrats ran the Persian territories. Chinese administrators ran the Chinese territories. The Mongols sat at the top of these existing hierarchies, collecting tribute and providing military force. But they were not trying to replace one civilization with another. They were trying to extract value from civilizations that already worked, and the most efficient way to do that was to leave most of those civilizations functional. This approach produced, during the Pax Mongolica, the great peace that settled over the Eurasian steppe and much of Central Asia for roughly a century after the main conquests, one of the most extraordinary periods of connected commerce in the pre-modern world. The Silk Road, which had functioned as a trading network for centuries, but had been disrupted by constant warfare between the various kingdoms and empires that controlled different sections of it, now passed for most of its length through a single political authority. A merchant who obtained a paisa, a sort of diplomatic passport issued by the Mongol administration, could travel from China to the Black Sea coast with the full protection of the imperial system. The relay station network, called the Yam, which allowed official messages to travel thousands of miles in days rather than weeks, also supported commercial traffic and communication on a scale the region had not seen before. Marco Polo, whose account of his travels through the Mongol Empire in the 1270s and 1280s remains one of the most valuable primary sources we have, repeatedly marvels at the infrastructure of the Yam system and the ease with which commerce moved through Mongol-controlled territories. Whatever one thinks of Polo as a narrator, and historians continue to debate the reliability of his account, his basic description of a connected commercial network spanning Eurasia aligns with what we know from other sources. The Mongol period saw a significant increase in the volume of long-distance trade, the movement of technologies, agricultural plants, and medical knowledge between East and West, and a level of cultural exchange that would have been impossible under the fragmented political arrangements that preceded Mongol unification. This connectivity had consequences that the Mongols themselves almost certainly did not anticipate. Among the things that traveled along the unified trade routes of the Mongol Empire, along with silk and spices and silver and horses, was the plague. The Black Death that devastated Europe, beginning in 1347 and killed somewhere between a third and a half of the European population, almost certainly originated in Central Asia and spread westward, along the trade networks that the Mongol peace had made so efficient. The same infrastructure that accelerated commerce also accelerated contagion. The consequences for the western end of Eurasia were, in a different way, as destructive as the Mongol conquests themselves had been. The fragmentation of the empire had begun well before the plague spread westward. Genghis Khan had divided his territories among his sons, expecting the family to rule jointly under the supreme authority of a great Khan, chosen by the family Kurultai. This system worked reasonably well for a generation or two, but the empire was simply too large, too diverse, and too internally complex to remain unified across multiple generations of succession. The different branches of the Chinggisid dynasty gradually became rulers of their own de facto independent states, with the theoretical suzerainty of the Great Khan becoming increasingly nominal. By the late 13th century, the Mongol Empire had effectively divided into four successor states. The Yuan dynasty, founded by Kublai Khan, controlled China and Mongolia. The Ilkhanate controlled Persia and much of the Middle East. The Chagatai Khanate controlled Central Asia. The Golden Horde controlled Russia and the Western Steppe. These successor states were in frequent conflict with each other, which rather contradicted the idea of a unified Mongol order, and they were gradually absorbed into or transformed by the civilizations they had conquered. The Yuan dynasty in China became, over time, essentially a Chinese dynasty that happened to be ruled by Mongols. Kublai Khan's court patronized Chinese art, scholarship, and Buddhism. The institutional forms of Chinese governance were maintained and in some ways elaborated. The Mongol rulers learned Chinese, adopted Chinese court rituals, and governed through the Chinese bureaucratic system. They were overthrown in 1368 by the Ming dynasty, a Chinese nationalist reaction against foreign rule. But the Yuan period left significant marks on Chinese administrative and cultural history that persisted long after the Mongols were gone. The Ilkhanate in Persia underwent an even more dramatic transformation. The Ilkhans converted to Islam within a few decades of the conquest of Baghdad in 1258, a conquest that had included the murder of the last Abbasid caliph and the destruction of a city that had been the cultural capital of the Islamic world for 5 centuries. Within a generation of that destruction, the Mongol rulers of Persia were devout Muslims patronizing Islamic scholarship and architecture, rebuilding cities, and presenting themselves as legitimate Islamic rulers in the tradition they had so recently obliterated, the famous Ilkhanid visual arts, which synthesized Mongol, Chinese, and Persian aesthetics, represent one of the most interesting artistic traditions of the medieval world, a direct product of the cultural collisions that the conquests had forced. The Golden Horde on the Western Steppe converted to Islam somewhat later and maintained its power over Russia for roughly 2.5 centuries, a period that Russians remember as the Tatar yoke. The tribute relationship that the Golden Horde imposed on Russian principalities and the administrative and military practices that the Russians adapted from Mongol models during this period had lasting effects on Russian state formation. Some historians argue that the centralized, autocratic character of the Russian state that emerged after the end of Mongol domination in the late 15th century was shaped partly by the political models that the Mongol overlordship had demonstrated. This is a contested argument, but it reflects the reality that 2.5 centuries of subordination to a foreign power tends to leave marks. The defeat of the Mongols at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, where the Egyptian Mamluk army stopped the Ilkhanid advance into Palestine and Syria, is sometimes described as one of the most significant battles in world history. The moment that stopped the Mongol juggernaut from rolling over the rest of the Islamic world and potentially into Africa and Europe. This framing overstates things somewhat. The Mongol advance into the Levant had already been slowed by logistical challenges and the death of the great Khan Möngke, which had pulled significant Mongol forces back east for the succession dispute. But Ain Jalut was genuinely significant. It was the first time a Mongol army had been defeated in a major engagement and not come back. It demonstrated that the Mongols were not in fact invincible, and it gave the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt a military and political prestige that it would trade on for decades. What the Mongol Empire was, in the end, is an extraordinarily difficult thing to categorize. It was a catastrophe on a scale that the medieval world had not seen before, and would not see again until the epidemics and conquests of the early modern period. It killed tens of millions of people, destroyed cities and agricultural systems that took generations to rebuild, and disrupted civilizations in ways whose consequences are still debated by historians. At the same time, it created the most extensive connected commercial and communication network the world had ever seen up to that point, accelerated the transfer of technologies and ideas between civilizations that had been essentially separate, and produced successor states and hybrid cultures of genuine historical interest and creativity. It was built by a man who had grown up as a refugee on his own steppe, fishing to survive while his father's former followers rode past without acknowledgement. That man took the raw material of nomadic life, the horses, the endurance, the tactical flexibility, the absolute ruthlessness that the steppe demanded of its survivors, and applied those qualities to the problem of imperial conquest with a systematic intelligence that no one who knew only the Mongols' origin would have predicted possible. He built institutions designed to outlast his own life. He promoted on merit when his world ran on birth. He incorporated his enemies' strengths rather than simply destroying them. He used information as a weapon as methodically as he used arrows and fire. The empire he created survived him by 150 years in some form, and its echoes lasted much longer. The trade routes his peace opened contributed to the commercial expansion that eventually funded the Age of Exploration. The diseases his infrastructure spread helped end the medieval period in Europe as surely as any army could have. The successor states his family built were absorbed into the DNA of Russian, Chinese, Persian, and Central Asian civilization in ways that are still visible today if you know where to look. The legal concept that all subjects, regardless of rank, answer to the same law, which was one of the Yasa's innovations, would echo through the development of legal thought in the regions the Mongols had touched. There is a village in Mongolia today, built near the banks of the Onon River, where the local tradition holds that Temujin was born. The land is still largely empty, still cold, still vast. The grass moves in the same wind it has always moved in. The descendants of the people who knew the Mongol Empire in its glory now live mostly in the way their ancestors did, in gurs on the steppe, with their horses, in a country sandwiched between Russia and China, the two great inheritors of civilizations that the Mongol armies once swept over. The largest empire in the history of the world, left behind, in the place where it began, a landscape almost as empty as it was before Genghis Khan was born by the river. Whether that is irony, or simply the nature of history, is a question each person has to answer for themselves. What is not a question is that it happened. That a child who survived on roots and fish in the harshest corner of Asia grew up to reshape the map of the entire known world in less than a single lifetime. That armies of nomads with no cities, no navy, no writing system, and no experience of complex administration conquered and then governed an area larger than the Roman and Persian empires combined. That the same force that destroyed the Library of Baghdad and the civilization of Khwarizm also built the trade network that connected China to Europe more reliably than had ever been possible before. The Mongol Empire does not fit neatly into the categories we use to organize historical memory. It was too destructive to romanticize, too sophisticated to dismiss, too consequential to ignore. It sits in the middle of the 13th century like a stone thrown into still water, with ripples moving outward in every direction. Through Russian history and Chinese history and Islamic history and European history, through the history of trade and disease and technology and law and war, all the way to the present, where we are still, in ways we rarely recognize, living in a world that the Mongols helped to make.